Hey, Pastor, are you looking for a resource that will help you minister to people walking through the valleys of pain, whether it be from a loss, a childhood trauma, sexual betrayal, divorce, or anything that has brought incredible suffering and hurt into the lives of your congregants? I know the needs are immense in the church that you serve, and it can be debilitating to even know where to begin. What if I told you that there was a proven path, a roadmap of sorts to help walk your people through whatever pain point they are experiencing and into greater freedom, healing, and purpose? Nothing is Wasted Pain to Purpose course is just that. We designed it for individuals and churches who are ready to engage their stories of pain so that they can experience healing and hope as they move forward. We know churches across the country who have used this tool and have seen incredible life change in not only individuals, but the overall health of their church. Listen to Pastor Kenneth Wagner of United Church in Delaware share what a difference Pain to Purpose has made at his church.
As a lead pastor, it has been one of the most rewarding things for me to watch people walk through Pain to Purpose and to be able to see that not only do we have a resource for them, but we've got a place, an atmosphere, a community where people can come to and just work through their stuff.
So if you're looking for tools you need to help people move from pain into purpose, we have what you've been looking for. Simply go to nothingiswasted.com/churches. Again, that's nothingiswasted.com/churches. It'll be right here in the show notes. It'll also be right here if you're watching on YouTube. To learn more and join churches all over the country that are bringing healing in a practical, biblical, trauma-informed way to those within their walls. nothingiswasted.com/churches.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Nothing is Wasted podcast. I am one of your hosts, Aubrey.
And I'm Davey, and we're so glad that you're back with us this week.
Woohoo!
We have a great conversation with Erika Andersen, a repeat podcast guest.
Repeat guest. She is a rare. She's like a friend of the show, and we don't have a lot of those yet.
Friend of the pod.
Yeah, friend of the pod. This is a new category. Very fun.
One of my favorite podcasts. They say that all the time. Friend of the pod.
They do.
And oh yeah, it's hilarious to me. And it's like it's totally, guys. I sometimes listen to podcasts that have nothing to do with anything that I do, just because it's like a good escape.
Yeah.
You just need to get away from it. But this particular podcast is like all of these venture capitalists that like get together and talk about what's going on in the markets and venture capitalism.
That's interesting.
Silicon Valley. It's a very interesting.
Yeah,
it's actually a
cool.
very prolific podcast. It's called All In. This is not an endorsement by any means. I wouldn't. But anyways, they say that a lot. They're like friend of the pod, and I'm like, that sounds so millennial. I don't even know what
you want to
Gen
know
Z.
something funny? I heard.
Yeah.
Tyler Huckabee, he's an editor at Relevant Magazine.
Yeah.
I once interviewed him, and I heard him say, subscribe, rate, and review to the podcast wherever you cast your pods. And now I say it all the time. Like, I stole it as if it's mine. So I'm always like, wherever you cast your pods, you can cast the Nothing is Wasted Ministries podcast. Yeah, but isn't that so like, that's so like Gen Z millennial, wherever you cast your pods.
Well,
She's
if you're
a friend
casting
of the pod.
That's right. If you're casting your pods, or if you're tubing your U's right now.
I like that. That was nice.
Yeah. Then Erika Andersen, this conversation is great. Aubrey, you actually wrote an endorsement for this book, Reason to Return.
I endorsed this book because she's writing about why women need the church and the church needs women. There are 16 million women who've left the American church in the last decade. So she's writing about why it's happened and why women need to return.
Wow.
Good reason, I think, for women to be leaving.
So
but
too.
I, of course, want women staying and leading and co-laboring for the gospel.
That's right.
So it's her call is towards that. So it's a really, really meaningful book, and you're going to love Davey's conversation with Erika.
Well, if you have been in church world or any kind of religious conversations or organization, I mean, you find that, and I don't know the actual data, but you find that like 75% of the makeup of that organization is usually women.
Isn't
like
that so wild?
It is.
And yet,
yes.
I just heard a statistics from Daniel Strickland that said there are more pastors named, I think it's John, than there are female pastors.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
We could get you on a soapbox for a while.
Oh, yeah. We could talk about this for a while. It might offend some of our listeners, but I am pro women in ministry. I'll just say that.
There's no surprise. No surprise by that. We're talking about some controversial topics over the past, episodes on the pod.
Nothing is wasted.
So we need to. Before we derail,
yes.
let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Erika Andersen, and Aubrey and I will be back on the back end of this to talk a little bit more about this conversation. Erika, great to have you back on the Nothing is Wasted podcast with me. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm pumped to be here.
I had to do a little double check when I saw that it was your name. I'm like, wait, we've had her on before, and this is awesome. It's very rare that we have people on multiple times. I'm so excited to hear about the new work that you're doing in this book that you've released and some of the inspiration behind it. If you want to go back and listen to our original conversation, the first conversation, I was early on in the podcast history, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was
like
2018. It feels like a lifetime ago after COVID.
Like there's a lot that's happened since 2018.
Yeah.
And that was episode 28, so you can go and listen to my conversation with Erika Andersen that we actually did in person in the old offices of the church that I used to pastor. That's how long ago this was. That's amazing.
Which was a really cool building.
It was a little bit of a janky building, to be honest with you, and then we kind of refabbed some of that building.
But it looked cool on the inside.
Yes, exactly. We did a really good job of renovating the inside of it. You would pull up to it and you're like, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was like, where am I? Am I in the right spot here?
That's what happens when you're, kind of a burgeoning church plant and you're trying to figure out how to just cobble things together. Well, Erika, we're talking about the church a little bit today. You've written this piece, your recent book. It's called Reason to Return. Why women need the church and the church needs women. And I love the overarching concept of this. I love what I've seen and what I've read about this. I think it's very timely and appropriate. I would love to hear a little bit about the inspiration behind this, because you do have a little bit of a story that has led you on this journey. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it actually originally stems from my first book. So for those that don't know, my first book was a memoir of my husband's life and sort of what he grew up in, poverty, trauma, abuse, neglect, all of these things. And so out of that book, I started doing a lot more freelance writing about things like the opioid crisis, alcoholism, child welfare, things like that. And as I began to sort of research and investigate, some of the reasons behind why we have these horrific things happening in society, I fell into some statistics really by accident that showed me, did you know that people that attend church on a weekly basis are happier? They have lower rates of anxiety. And particularly women are 5 times less likely to ever commit suicide if they attend church regularly. And so I started to run into these statistics that were just so important for mental health and, family and community and society. And I realized that nobody was really talking about it. I ended up writing a piece about, it was titled for the Wall Street Journal, "Is God the Answer to the Suicide Epidemic?" Because, and I promise I'll get to the book here in a second.
No, please. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, and so what I realized when I was kind of looking at suicide websites and, the suicide hotline, none of them mentioned faith or finding a church community. They didn't mention that, and yet statistics, and I'm talking statistics from like Pew, Gallup, secular statistical institutions, showed that faith is a huge component of someone finding contentment and finding better mental health. And so I wrote about that in the Wall Street Journal, and that ultimately kind of led me down the path of more research through like Barna, Lifeway, all of that. And I started to see this one stood out to me: women have been leaving the church at faster rates than ever before in history. And I was like, I haven't heard that before. That's so interesting. And what I came to find out is that women have actually been leaving at more than double the rates of men in the past 12 years. So men have always left at faster rates, but something's going on with women. And that's really concerning because women have always been actually the majority of the church. They have made up more of the church than men historically, ever since, walking around with Jesus, which is really, always something I like to mention, because we know like Jesus really uplifted women, and the Bible is one of the only historical documents that showcases women in such a worthy and respected way. And so I thought, there is something going on. I've got to look into this. And that is really what led me. I remember I found that stat and I had been kind of thinking, what is my next book going to be about? And when I found that, I sort of felt like God told me, like, this is it. And that was it. That day at the kitchen table, this very kitchen table I'm sitting at, I moved on from there, and I didn't know if I would get a book deal again. I didn't know where it was going. I just knew I was going to write it, and that's what God had for me.
Wow, man. As you were looking at some of these statistics, in the early part of this research process, you noted already that there's a high correlation between people of faith or people who attend church regularly and lower instances of suicide or depression and anxiety. Can you talk to me about that a little bit? Like, as you're diving into that, draw the dots for me.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand, why is that the case, especially from your vantage point?
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out, and this is why my book, kind of centers specifically on church, not just faith, because it wasn't just people of faith.
Yeah.
It was people that are consistently attending church. And I don't necessarily, people get a little confused. We're talking about the church, of course, just a distinction here, like the universal church is what we Christians are all a part of. Everyone that's a Christian is a part of the universal church and family of God. But the local church is sort of that smaller entity that we are all called to be a part of. And that faith community is really what I liked. I was just sitting at church the other day, and, the pastor said something like, "Do you hear me, church?" or something like that. And I was like, yeah, like, he's not talking to the building. He's talking to the people, because we are the church. And so making that distinction, that faith community, being a part of that, is really what makes the difference. And I think that's because God created us for that. God created us to be in community and to be a part of the body.
Right.
And every single Christian has been equipped with a unique spiritual gift that that the body is not complete without them, and to where they flourish when they're a part of it. Lost my train of thought. I was going somewhere with that.
Yeah.
I just lost it. Okay, I'll let you ask me again, and then I'll.
For sure. So there's a lot of variance that you're talking about right there. You've got some people who are people of faith, but they don't necessarily attend church for possibly a variety of different reasons, right? Maybe they've been wounded or hurt by the church, or maybe they've just kind of become disenfranchised by the church. I know that has been a fairly prevalent thought over the past couple of years, especially since COVID. I know anecdotally, as I talk to pastors and as I've experienced it as a pastor, you saw kind of this and somewhat of an exodus from church attendance post-COVID, because people were, they were watching online, and all of a sudden this idea of comfort and convenience kind of crept in, and they're deciding, we don't really need to be in church in person. We can kind of just tune in, or we can kind of tune into our favorite communicator or something, and we're just going to get fed that way. And so I think there's so many different variants that are playing into this. You're also talking about people who just attend church, and their church attendance is just the worship experience, and that's it. It doesn't go any further than that. And so maybe dive into that even deeper. You mentioned the most important aspect of this is church community. I imagine in that, because you've got some people who are listening, they're like, well, I just kind of like have my small group, and that's like our church community, so to speak. Where on the spectrum are you seeing we really need to try to find ourselves in correlation with some of these statistics? And maybe that's not asked well, but I hope you understand where I'm going. Like, paint a picture for this is what it would look like for someone to line up with what these statistics are saying.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it looks one exact way, which is one of the sort of underlying messages of the book, is that it doesn't have to look the way it's always looked for you, or the stereotype of what going to church looks like. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because I wanted people who maybe have had a bad experience, or one they didn't like, or were hurt in the past, that they could envision a different kind of church future for themselves. Because we know that's one thing I love, is that there are so many churches, and each of them are different and unique. They each have their own experience, the way they worship, the way they go about things. They look different. They're big and small and all these different things. And so I think we have a lot of freedom in choosing how we engage with a church community. And so, but one of the most prevalent things you've heard, I've heard, we've all heard, like, I don't need to go to church to have a relationship with God. I don't need church. Like, I've been hurt by that. People are hypocrites. Those are many of the things that we've heard. But the reality is, I mean, not to get too far into that side of things right now, is that like any community that you're a part of, you are probably going to be hurt by people.
Right,
and
right.
so that's something to keep in mind. You're probably never going to be part of a community where someone doesn't hurt you.
That's exactly right.
But secondly, if you were a part of a community that was harmful or hurtful, or even you just didn't like it, you don't have to go back to that specific thing. But according to the statistics, in terms of like what is it that is actually giving people this better mental health and stronger community and making these societal differences on an individual level, it's consistency, and it's showing up sort of, doesn't necessarily have to be the same place, but it usually is showing up in the same place, communing with people. And what you will find is that that being with people of faith that share your faith, that share your love of God, it sort of changes the actions and behaviors and even the emotions that you're feeling, because you're in the vicinity of need. You are not thinking just about yourself. You are where the Holy Spirit is working among his people, because the Holy Spirit really shows up, I believe, in a really different and more, I don't want to say more powerful, but a powerful, different way in when he is among a collective
Group
people.
of believers. That's right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, Scripture says that, right? He inhabits the praise of his people.
Yes.
There is a manifest presence that occurs collectively that we cannot experience individually, right? We absolutely can experience his presence individually, of course, right? That's part of having a personal relationship with Jesus, but there is something even further beyond that we can only experience with a collective group of believers.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've lost in the past maybe couple of decades is an understanding of why the church matters. And it matters just like our individual relationship with God matters.
Yeah.
There's, especially in the West, been this extremely, kind of hyper individualistic focus on our personal relationship with Jesus, which matters. It's true. Right. However, I think many times that's been sort of a message that kind of covers up the message of how important it is to me to be among God's people. And
So
you see that in the wider world where Christianity is thriving in Africa and Asia. We see Christianity is growing by leaps and bounds. In the West, it is shriveling, because I think partially because of our hyper individualism and our isolation and our tendency to not think that we need other people, but yet God has built into us this need for community. And you see that even outside of the Christian space. Every person, whether they're Christian or not, thrives and flourishes when they have community as a part of their life. And so that is part of our image bearing of God, is that we need that, and that's built into us. But as Christians coming together as the church, it's even more powerful and makes a huge difference in terms of growing our faith and growing spiritually and getting to know God on another level.
Yeah. Wow. That's so good. That's so true. I mean, I think that we completely, I would agree with you, we completely miss the communal aspects of what Jesus wanted our faith to look like. Because, one, we're just in a Western Hellenistic culture. Like, we do not understand that. In fact, I don't want to get political at all right here, so hear me if you're listening to this. This is not, this is not some kind of I'm not advocating for any kind of political party or any kind of political stance. But I think even in the, because in America we value so much our freedoms, we can be turned off to anything that looks and smells like community or communal type, right? There's a massive kind of Christian nationalism that begins to push way back against any kind of look of socialism, right? And I'm not saying that's good, bad, or ugly, but what I'm saying is I think because of that, we can throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we can miss some of the beautiful aspects of community that Jesus has brought to us and said, hey, actually, I want you guys to have both this Western perspective of the gospel and an Eastern perspective of the gospel. I've shared this before on the podcast, Erika, but the Bema podcast, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that or listened to that. Marty Solomon is one of my favorite podcasts. He takes an Eastern perspective or an Eastern view because he's Jewish, but he's not a Messianic Jew, but he's a Jew that believes Jesus is the Christ, right? And so he's a evangelical Christian that is Jewish. So he has a very unique perspective, and he says that if we read the Bible purely with a Western perspective, which is what most of us approach the Bible with, it's like playing a piano with just your left hand on the bass clef. It's very difficult to interpret even what song it is, because we're missing the fullness and the richness of the cultural heritage of this book is a Eastern book written to an Eastern people that is pervasive among all cultures.
Right.
But if we only read it from an Eastern perspective, then we're only reading it the treble clef with our right hand. So you get the melody, but you don't get the richness and the fullness. You've got both of those that have to come together to play and sync to really understand the fullness of what Jesus is trying to bring to the entire world, both Western and Eastern cultures. So I think we have to understand, as you're saying, where the ditches that we're going to fall into, because we're just so informed by an individualistic Western Hellenistic culture, right?
Yeah, and also that just, reminds me of how so many of us were, growing up here in America. We read a verse of the day. We are not reading the Bible in its full context so much. Something I'm really trying to impart to my kids right now is like, listen, the Bible is not like this one story about David and Goliath, right? Or Jonah and the whale. This is like the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's one big story, and you cannot read it in isolation. It doesn't work that way. And so that's something that I don't really feel like was drilled into my head. And so I'm making it a really big priority to teach my kids in that way. And in the same way, going back to the book, I think a lot of people haven't been informed or educated about, the purpose of the church, why we go to church. And if you don't know the why of why you're doing something, it's a lot harder to stay motivated to do it. But when you're kind of informed about, why God made this body and what he's doing through it and what's happening, and how you play a role in that, there's a lot more powerful of an incentive to be a part of it. And so I feel like there's been a lot of education missing. And something else I talk about sort of outside of the book and some writing I've done is just like, I don't know if you've seen this, Davey, but like I feel like there's just like Sunday school has disappeared, like church history, theology, all of that. That's not around. It's been replaced by small groups, which don't get me wrong, I love a small group, and I have one. But people aren't learning what why we believe what we believe, and I think that is really part of what's causing an exodus for some people in young adulthood.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, that now that you mentioned that, it's 100% true. We are very much involved with a small group, and I end up supplementing all of that kind of learning that you would have gotten in Sunday school on other mediums.
Like
other
I read
platforms.
books and
whether it's reading books or whether it's like
podcast,
consuming content on podcasts. Exactly, that's so true. Hey friends, I'm curious, has Nothing Is Wasted as a ministry had an impact on your Pain to Purpose story? Whether it be from the encouragement you've received from this podcast, or going through the Pain to Purpose course, or the 42-day devotional, or being a part of the Nothing Is Wasted community, we want to hear how nothing is wasted and the resources we have to offer have directly impacted your life. We know so many of you have seen God work through the stories you've heard on this podcast or through your local church's Pain to Purpose course that you've been a part of. And we want to hear how Nothing Is Wasted has been a part of God's healing and redemptive plan in your life. Now, I know God isn't done yet. And I know from personal experience, he is often healing us and stepping into our pain in 1,000 different ways. And oftentimes he uses everything from the podcasts we listen to the courses we sign up for, to the people in our life, and more. So we want to ask you a favor. Would you share those stories with us? We would love to start collecting your experience on how we have been able to partner with you as you have partnered with God to take back your story. So do us a massive favor. Again, share those with us. Share with us what God has done in your story through Nothing Is Wasted by doing this. Okay, if you want to share your story with us, please do this. Go to nothingiswasted.com/stories. Again, nothingiswasted.com/stories. It'll be in the show notes. It'll be right here at YouTube if you're watching YouTube. There you're going to find instructions on how to submit your story and all the details for recording the ways that God has used Nothing Is Wasted to move you from pain into a newfound healing and purpose. You can also experience all the other story submissions that people have recorded right there at nothingiswasted.com/stories. So watch those, Be blessed by those, and then submit your story, please. We would love to hear from you on how God is using this ministry to impact your life. We can't wait to hear what you have to say. Again, go to nothingiswasted.com/stories. Let us know how Nothing Is Wasted has impacted your healing journey. nothingiswasted.com/stories. I love what you mentioned earlier about this idea of, because people exist in community, you're going to get hurt no matter what community there is. Mm-hmm. Right? No matter if it's in the church or somewhere else. You know, I was a part of a CrossFit gym, a CrossFit box for a while that had some transition, and it was an incredible community when we first were a part of it. And it was like, there was a richness for about 6 months to a year that was like, oh my gosh, these are my people. Right. And then there, you know, inevitably, just like any community, there arose some drama, some tension, some conflict around some of the members of that community, and they didn't know how to resolve that conflict. Transition happened, and now that whole entire community is dispersed. And, you know, but here's the thing. I've run into so many of them. They all still do CrossFit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's...
They didn't leave CrossFit because of it.
Because of the why, because they understood the value of CrossFit supersedes the hurt that they've experienced. So if I superimpose that onto what our conversation about the church, what we see happen a lot, to your point, Erika, is that people will get hurt by the church. And maybe it's because they hold the church at a much higher standard. They go, well, this is the place that I shouldn't get hurt because everyone should be acting like Jesus. And so maybe it creates an even deeper wounding. Or maybe the enemy has some kind of involvement in all of this. I'm sure all of the above, right? But because of their hurt, they say they start to attach the two, and they go, well, I'm going to leave church and leave the faith altogether, rather than remembering, no, this is what the church is supposed to be about, right? Like Jesus loves his church despite her bumps and bruises, right? He is for the church, and he wants us as his people to be for the church and continuing to reform and revitalize what he sees as the vision for the church.
Yeah, in a similar way, I use this example as well. Any kind of trauma in your past. So if you were in a car accident or you were in, an abusive relationship, whatever, that doesn't mean that you should never get into a relationship again, that you should never get into a car again.
That's right.
You would go to counseling, right? And they would try to coach you to heal from your trauma, to find ways to deal with the PTSD from whatever that situation was, and find healthy coping mechanisms and be able to approach this from a healthy perspective and be rational. Now, I take pains in the book to talk about, like, this doesn't have to be a rushed process. If I do think that if you're hurt by the church, like, that is probably a deeper wound than just, a random friend, because it is another level. It is a spiritual level that's kind of, deeper than, just your basic other kind of community. And I get that. And I encourage people to take the time that they need to step away, to pray about it, to potentially get counseling, get support from friends, and hopefully seek out trusted, like, spiritual mentors and things like that. I think ultimately, though, like everything else that we might experience in life, we want to get back to a healthy place where we can operate and move in this world as someone who has been healed. And I think I see a lot of people kind of, like, oftentimes it seems like they're sitting in it. They're I don't want to say dwelling on it, because I think you do have to kind of focus on that for a while. And sometimes people...
They're getting stuck or wallowing.
Yeah, they're getting stuck and staying there. And then, like, sometimes you see these Instagram accounts that are ex-evangelical and all of that kind of stuff. And that's just like a lot of bitterness simmering beneath the surface without finding healing. And I sometimes have been told, oh, well, you're invalidating someone's experience. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, I think that if you've been hurt, that's awful. I think that breaks God's heart, especially a spiritual leader who, by the way, God has given much more accountability to, and they will, face the consequences for that more so than just your average Joe. And so, God is a God of justice, and he doesn't want to see that either. But how can we kind of walk through that, envision a different future within the church? And also, like, you don't have to go back there. it doesn't have to look like it did in the past. And there are bridges to walk over to get to a safe place where ultimately God will work in your life and I think draw you back to a local church.
Right. Yeah, you know what's really interesting is when you think about that term ex-evangelical, or, you know, as people begin to label themselves, I think they've forgotten really what evangelical is about and what it means, right? It does not mean, although it can be associated with, because of a lot of the abuse that has taken place, this cult of personality power structure that ends up being this really fast-growing church that kind of bulldozes over people's hurts and needs. While that can be associated with that, that's not what evangelical means, right? And so to say, like, I'm ex-evangelical, you're literally saying, okay, I am no longer associating myself with the teachings of the gospel.
Yeah, I'm against the gospel.
I'm against a regenerated heart and the fact that there is salvation by grace through faith alone, a faith that is not of your own, so that you can't boast. That's what I'm now against, right? And so I think that you're right. I think we in culture, things are so inflammatory and binary because of the political environments that keep drumming that up, right? In media. And so we just get caught up in that as well as Christians. And we're supposed to step back and be different. We live in a different kingdom with an upside down way of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think evangelical, I mean, that term is so loaded and it's been co-opted by the culture and it's been, you know, associated with politics now. And it really is frustrating for those of us who feel that we are, you know, true evangelicals and it's not associated with political party. But it's I think getting back to the basics, and definitions matter, and let's get back to like what is the church supposed to be, what is true, and what do you really believe about God. Now I will say one of the, you know, sort of positive outtakes about this whole thing for me is that I don't see a lot of people that are angry at God. I don't see a lot of people that are kind of like, God is the problem here.
Right.
And so it does seem to be more about, you know, people that have caused a problem.
The institution of the church, yeah.
Right. And so I say, because this book, you know, this is for Christian women. This isn't for someone who's like, I'm an atheist now.
Right.
This is for someone who says, I love God. And so I just encourage people to say, if you love God, take his word seriously. I encourage people, like, lead with prayer. You can't do this without prayer. The Holy Spirit is going to work and you have to trust that. You don't have to just like take actions and make decisions like just because I say so, right? And it's also not just about, you know, a lot of people kind of bristle sometimes like, oh, statistics, like it's just like, oh, you just go to church. Well, that could just be going to church and that doesn't really mean anything. Well, it's a combination of things. I talk about holistic faith in this book, and I talk about how going to church doesn't make you a Christian, but it is, I think, one piece of sort of our faith pie. Gathering with believers is part of a holistic Christian faith, along with, you know, worship and personal relationship and prayer and, you know, generosity and all of these things. And so I think when the piece is missing of gathering with believers, you are not experiencing everything God wants you to have on this earth. And you're also, because you play an integral role in the church, and we have all been created with these special parts to be a part of it, you're like denying someone else sort of the gift that you bring to the whole body.
That's right.
And you don't know what you're missing when you don't show up. And you don't, like, there's something about that in-person, tangible experience. You know, every time I go to, like, I always say in front of my church, I said the other day I was speaking about the book, and I said, you know, I come to church always. Like, if I'm in a bad mood, if I've been crying, if my kids are driving me crazy, I go to church. And most of the time, I'm really glad I went. Most of the time, I feel comforted by that. And so I think, you know, those are some of the other things to be thinking about in this whole conversation.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, I got two big questions. This could launch us on two different rabbit trails. The first one, though, that I want to ask you is, experientially for you, Erika, you know, you write a little bit about how the church came around you in a very difficult time. And so I'm sure that has informed a lot of this as well for you. You've been able to experience the beauty of the body of Christ during some difficult seasons of your life. You want to share that with us a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So one of my I'm trying to make this a motto. I'm saying it's one of my mottos. I'm just trying to make it a motto. I put this up on Instagram recently. I said church should be more like an AA meeting because I quit drinking about 2.5 years ago. That's something that had always been sort of a struggle in my life. I had a really unhealthy relationship with alcohol. I used it in ways that I shouldn't. I have a lot of alcoholism in my family. So does my husband. And so it took me a long time to get to that point. But once I got into a community, now granted it wasn't a Christian community, but it was like similar to an AA type of community. Right. I started to recognize how beautiful these spaces were because people walked in and we didn't know each other, but within a couple minutes, like people are pouring their hearts out and laying their brokenness out before you, asking for support. And I was like, wow, I want church to be more like this. Yeah. I want people to feel like they can walk in with all their stuff and just set it down and be like, I'm here. Yeah. And instead of, you don't have to do your hair or whatever. Right. And so, one of the things I did about 6 months after getting sober is I told my story to my church. I got up in front of the whole church and told the story. And that's because I felt called to go first. I felt called to start creating that safe space for people. Yeah. Because when people see that you have given them this information, all of a sudden you become very safe for them to divulge their information. And my safety started in a small group from church. I had never admitted to anyone outside of my husband and my best friend that I felt like I was struggling and I just didn't know what to do. And the moment that I decided at prayer request time one night to admit this and say I'm struggling was the moment that I began to feel freedom. Wow. Because the shame and sin, it literally cannot survive once it's in the light. It can't. When you put it in the light of Jesus, which he is light, I mean, that is what he is, it starts to take over that darkness. And that was the first step towards me finding freedom. And so after I told my small group, I was able to talk about it more. I began to get more open about it to the point where I'd will tell anybody at this point. Wow. And it was so beautiful. Like, I just look back on that moment when I finally told them, and I just see like this beautiful thing being unlocked, and they were there for me. And then my church has been there for me. Wow. When I, revealed it to them, they have been there all the way. And even after I had spoken in front of the church after those 6 months, I actually went back to drinking after that. And then, did it again. And now it's been 2.5 years. So I'm feeling really solid now. But there was no judgment. There was nothing but love and support and people coming around me. And I didn't feel any sort of, shaming coming from them. If not, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, and I was so thankful for that. And I think people maybe don't necessarily always see the church as that, but that is what it can be. And I guarantee you that is what most people in the church want it to be.
That's what they desire. Yep.
It's like people that are pastors and ministry teams. It's like, what do you think we're doing every week? We want you to walk in and feel loved. We want you to walk in and feel support. We want to include you. We want you not to feel alone, and we want you to feel the love of Jesus in everything that we're doing. That's
right. That's so true. That's so true. Yeah, it's so important for those who are watching this, listening to this, to hear what Erika's saying right now, because you might find yourself caught up in some kind of a habit, some kind of an addiction that you feel shame for. And we want to encourage you to bring that to light. And at the same time, we also want to encourage those who are creating those spaces, whether it's small groups, whether it's church environments, to create a space that's safe enough for people to bring that stuff to light. So that it's not
be vulnerable yourself. Be the first one.
Lead
create
the way.
That. Mm-hmm.
That's so good. That way it's not met with condemnation. That way it's not met with more shame. That way it's not met with judgmentalism. It's met with grace. It's met with an empathy that says, hey, you know what? I understand. I get it. I'm there too, or I've been there too, and let's walk through this together. That's what the church should be about. I love what you said, that it should be more like an AA meeting than anything else, right? And it really should. We have a course that we launch in churches called Pain to Purpose. And that's what we try to help churches do. We try to help them facilitate those environments where it's support group style healing. Mm-hmm. And that's when the body is ministering to the body, first of all, it takes so much pressure off the pastoral staff, right? Because now you're not having to respond to every bit of the care needs. And it just creates this ripple effect of healing throughout the church where now all of a sudden you have permission to talk about your pain, but not in a sense of like, okay, we're just going to wallow in this. It's not just going to be a Me Too environment. It's going to be a, hey, Me Too, now let's move through this. Let's heal from this. Let's get beyond this so we can step into the mission that God has for us in building his kingdom. I love that you experienced that, Erika, because a lot of people, they don't get to experience that. It's so cool.
Yeah, and I think, there was so much fear, and I think, just to say this, if anybody's listening that can relate to this, there was a lot of fear in admitting it because I was afraid, what if I fail? Like, what if I keep messing up? What if, I look stupid? People are going to judge me. Like, what if we're at an event and I don't know. There was all these fears.
Right.
And once I actually said it and did it and started walking through it, I don't have those fears anymore. Like, even if I were to fall back into it now, I know that I could admit it and start again.
Yeah.
Like, because we know, we're 70 times 7, right?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
we have endless amounts of grace as Christians, and we should have that for one another. And I've never felt anything but that within my faith community.
Wow. That's awesome. That's awesome. So, let's talk a little bit more about this book. You specifically are talking about women leaving the church. And you mentioned earlier that is very disturbing because of how vital women are to the church. So I've got kind of a two-part question. One, why do you think there is maybe an influx of women leaving the church? Why is that kind of increased? And then why is that so important? Like, what kind of vitality do women provide the church that's distinct to women, not not across both gender roles?
Yeah, well, like so many things, it's very nuanced. There's never just one reason why something is happening, so you kind of have to dive in. There's multiple reasons that I talk about in the book, and I'll start with this one. We're just sort of moving into a post-Christian culture in general in the West, and so that's one sort of just side effect of that is more people in general are leaving. Now, when it comes to women specifically, what you'll find if you look at data about, the lives of women and moms in America, women are more stressed out than men. Women are more overwhelmed. They generally do take on, especially when we're talking about families, they often take on more responsibilities of the household and the children. And that is just the way it is. And so women are feeling very overwhelmed by life, stressed out. And so I think many of the women that I'm speaking to have not sort of gone, I'm leaving church, like I'm making this decision. It sort of happened slowly. It happened over time. They needed to let something go. And this was the easiest thing because it wasn't a requirement. So that's one thing. We're just seeing that.
Yeah.
Interestingly, at the same time, women in these same kind of polls, this was from a Barna poll, said that the number one thing they wanted to improve in their lives was their relationship with God and their faith life. In the same poll, they said, actually, though, that was the thing they were putting last on the priority list.
Wow.
So I think we have a lot of people that kind of have this ideal that they want in their lives, but they're not sort of stopping the madness and the chaos of life long enough to intentionally think about what that means.
Yeah.
How are we arranging our lives? So that's another piece of this, and a really big piece of this. And then in addition to that, I do think people are seeing some of the things that have happened within the church, or they've experienced it themselves. Some of the abuse stories that have come out, some of the, I hear people talk about like misogyny sometimes as being part of that, feeling like they don't have a voice within the church, maybe especially if they've gone to a more traditional church or potentially like a fundamentalist version of a church. And so there's a lot of different things. And single mothers and single women are the highest demographic leaving.
Wow.
For different reasons. I mean, single mothers, obviously, because they just don't have a lot of time. They don't have a lot of help.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get to church with your kids by yourself.
Yeah.
And then single women would say they kind of feel like they don't belong, or they don't have a voice, or they're not seen. That's a lot of the stuff you hear from that group. So, those are some of the other reasons. And then you'll find things like, people that feel like their questions have been sort of shamed, or, they're not feeling like politics has become a part of the, the whole mess, and they just don't want to deal with it. So it goes down the line. And I think this is particularly couple reasons that for women this is particularly bad. The obvious reasons, which we've already talked about, but number two, I think women are often the ones that are leading their children in the faith. And when women are not going to church, taking their kids to church, or kind of leading kids at home, kids are missing out so much on building that spiritual faith foundation that they need. And it's such a critical time under the age of 14 to build that and build your belief system. That is when most people kind of decide like whether or not they're going to be a Christian by the age of 14, which is kind of crazy. And then secondly, like God has equipped women with unique spiritual gifts. Like, you know, everybody's different, right? But oftentimes women have gifts that men don't have. And so, you know, when you don't have as many women in there, you know, utilizing those gifts, whether it be, you know, a teaching role or a hospitality role, or, you know, whatever it is that God has equipped them with, like it's going to be off balance.
Yeah, that's right.
And the church is made up of men and women, and we know that God sees them as equally valuable with different roles in many cases. And that's how he created the world, and that's how he wants the church to be as well.
Right. Yeah, you know what's interesting is I heard it broken down at the very, you know, when it talks about God created a helper for Adam. Obviously, that means two different things to two different camps of people. You've got your complementarian camp, you've got your egalitarian camp, right? But one of the best interpretations of that I heard was the original Hebrew of essentially it connotes this idea of opposing forces, almost like two like things leaning on each other. That there is a force that one side brings that props up the other side, and vice versa. But they're both distinct directions of forces, and they can't really exist true without the other.
Yeah.
And it was like such an eye-opening thing to me to think, oh my gosh, this is so true, you know. And if you think about that in your marriage, or if you think about that in church leadership or organizational leadership, that we need each other, right? That there is distinctions between men and women that are necessary for us to be able to cooperate together and to really like uphold and support the gifts within each one of us, right? Like that we're support for each other, we're helpers for each other, as opposed to just this one-sided, one-way kind of pure like complementarian extreme perspective. And I wonder too if that is, you know, as you're talking about this, I'm going, man, there's been a huge transition over the past several decades where you're seeing women kind of fortunately being able to emerge from that just really in some ways oppressive complementarian culture into a space where they're being given a voice, where they're being given, you know, but then there hasn't been kind of a counterbalance of that. So women are carrying so much, right? For example, you've got a woman who's working a full-time job and carrying all of the household responsibilities that she would have back in the 50s, so to speak, you know, and there hasn't been this like renegotiation in a lot of ways in many households that I believe is creating a lot of stress for women, a lot of feelings of overwhelm.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You know, I feel fortunate that in my home, I feel like my husband is pretty good about like the equal sharing of responsibilities, but it kind of is just a cultural thing. And I don't think anybody necessarily does it on purpose, but it's like we are still raised in this way. And women do take on, I think, more of a mental load. And if you think about things like, you know, scheduling doctor's appointments and making sure that, you know, whatever is done for the school stuff and all of that, like often that does give women a lot more stress in their lives, is that mental load thing. In terms of the complementarian versus egalitarian, I purposely didn't really, you know, touch that in my book because it's not about that. You could write a whole other book. It can be kind of inflammatory
too when you start talking about that, right?
One of those things,
creating polarization of
audiences. And I'm seeing, you know, I'm on Twitter, so you know they're fire bombs all the time over there
from probably both sides coming at you, right?
Yeah,
Erika?
yes. And I don't get much into the conversation because that, you know, sort of that conversation for me is not one that I really want to be a part of.
Yeah, that's great.
It's not the most important thing for me. However, I do see a lot of extremes. Like I see people talking, complementarianism always leads to abuse. You know, you have to be an egalitarian. No, I don't think that's true. I think that when you're taking God, scripture for what it is and how God intended it, like it's not going to lead to abuse. Do I think people have used it for abuse? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And so what I try to focus on in the book is not whether or not complementarianism is good or bad for women, but we need to be listening to women overall on more of these things. One of the things I recently wrote about was, I talk in the book about purity culture and some of the stuff that I went through with that and how that was so awful. And I recently wrote an article for Christianity Today, interviewing a woman who works with women who are like kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. And she said, when it comes to sexuality in the church, you have men sort of teaching men about it. You have men teaching women about it. You have women teaching women about it. But what you don't have is women teaching men about it. And I thought that is a great point. We are missing the female perspective. Whether or not they're standing in front of the church, it's in front of the podium on a Sunday, men need to hear from women, not only on issues of sexuality, but all kinds of different things, because women's perspective matters.
Right.
So whether that means you're having lunch and chatting it up, or you have a board of women that you're talking to, like, I do think that women's voices are missing in some ways from a lot of churches, and I would like to see that improved no matter what kind of church you go to.
Right. Wow, that's so good. That's so good, man. So, I guess to kind of like, as we're thinking about all of this, what would you've said so many different things that I know you would implore the church to really consider and to make adjustments in and stuff. But I think what I'm thinking of right now is maybe kind of to give you the final word on what, if someone's listening to this, they've experienced some kind of abuse that they associate with the church, or some kind of hurt that they associate with the church. And they're really teetering. They're considering, okay, I don't know. Should I give this another shot? I just feel like this has been my experience over and over. It seems like I'm getting, from peers. They're also saying this is their experience. Maybe I should give up on the church. What would you say? Because I know that that's really the heart behind this book and the heart behind what you're sharing right now. How would you, if you're sitting down to coffee with somebody who's really experiencing this kind of wrestling, what would you say to them?
The first thing I would say is to lead with prayer. I mean, I think you always have to start there. You have to pray that the Holy Spirit is going to work and speak to you, that that your heart and your mind is open to what God wants to say, that your heart and your mind is open to truth and have the ability to discern. I think that's the most powerful thing that you can do foundationally starting out in this journey. The second thing I would say is not to put pressure on yourself to rush into anything, and to recognize that God doesn't have... God is infinite, and there is no need to try to fix this or rush into, like, I have to go attend church this Sunday. You don't. And so I would say giving yourself the freedom and space to process, heal, pray. And I guess, the last thing starting out is I would say try to find a trusted friend of faith, someone that you can go to talk with, ask questions, and be as honest as possible. Yeah. I think, people get caught up in like, well, it's God, like, I don't, who am I to, but no, like, God wants you to wrestle with these things. I mean, just read the Bible. Yep. People wrestle with God and ask him questions, and they go through things and they don't understand. And when you do that, you get to know God better. And when you do that, and you're reading scripture and praying, like, you're going to get back some like really rich stuff from God. Yeah. Like, he's going to speak to you through that pain and through that wrestling. And I just pray that your heart would be open to what he's saying and that you would be able to take action on it. It's not about finding a new church and starting into a small group like right away. Right. I think ultimately God is going to lead you there, but if it's not there right now, that's okay.
That's so good. So good. Erika, this has been wonderful. I'm so glad that you agreed to come back on and join us for this. And if you guys are watching this on YouTube, or if you listen to this on any of our any podcast platform that you can listen to this on, I want to make sure I point you in the direction of Reason to Return, which is Erika's latest book. Again, why women need the church and the church needs women. And I just love this. I love the message that you're spreading right now, that you're carrying. I think it's very timely, very appropriate, and very necessary. And so, Erika, thanks for spending time. Where can we follow you? Where can we pick up this book?
Yeah, so you can get a lot of details on the book, reasontoreturn.co, C-O, or it's also on Amazon, christianbook.com, all the things, NAF Press website. You can follow me on Instagram at Erika_Andersen, or find me on my website at erikaandersen.com.
Awesome. And make sure you note the unique spelling of Erika's
Yes.
name, Ericka, and Andersen with an E at the end, not an
I
O
know,
at the end.
I always have to explain that. But yes, if you Google me, I'll probably you'll see all the things.
It'll pop up. That's true. I actually
Yeah.
tried it. I tried to see if it was, Andersen O-N and everything popped up. So
It does.
you are carrying enough of a message that
I'm well known on the Google search engine.
That's right. You're going to be seen. So make sure you check that out. We'll also put an easy access link right here on the show notes of this podcast episode if you're listening in Apple Podcasts and on the podcast page on our website. Erika, it's so great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us, and looking forward to having another conversation with you next time you write another book. This will be
We'll
great.
see. Thank you.
Great. Well, why women are leaving the church?
Women should go back to
and
the
why
church.
they
That's-
need the church, and
Yeah.
the church needs women.
No, I appreciate this conversation because there is a whole lot of church hurt, I think,
There is.
that women have experienced. I'm grateful that
Yeah.
it seems like women of newer generations are not feeling that as much, as churches are kind of broadening their understanding and their convictions
Right.
about who women can be in churches.
Right.
But it's a pain point for a lot of women who just were sidelined or silenced or squelched. And so I appreciate a couple things. Her call to name that, but then also Erika's call to be like, there's a part, women, you play, like, you need to be there. Like, be
Right.
faithful in a local body because that body desperately needs you. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's a pain point. We think about church hurt, but not specifically for women all the time. And it's a real thing. So
Yeah, it melds two pain points together. It melds church hurt with kind of the gender role,
yeah.
power struggle
Yeah.
kind of pain point.
Yeah.
that's
I know you have
very
something to
real.
talk about, but can I tell you a quick story related
Please
to
do,
this,
yeah.
maybe? I was speaking at a church a couple of weekends ago in Chicago, and they're a little more like they're very complementarian, which is great. We have a lot of
Okay.
complementarian listeners.
Do we need to explain these two sides of this
yeah,
camp?
we
for those
probably
of
do.
you
We probably do. Okay, so
in summary,
wow. In
Aubrey,
summary,
go ahead.
Thank you.
Complementarianism versus egalitarianism. Go ahead and explain
In
that a
summary,
little bit.
complementarianism would say like women ought to be in submission to men who God has ordained as like leaders of the church, leaders of the home, etc. Egalitarian would say God has called us to be co-laborers for the gospel in the home, etc.
Right.
There's a little more. Both would say equality, but egalitarians would actually say like men and women are equal in gifting, calling, etc.
Right.
Complementarian
So what you
would
tend
not
to
say
see,
that.
it doesn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't speak acutely to this, but like in a complementarian culture, you tend to see, like even the family unit, the man's going to be the sole
Yeah.
provider.
Yeah.
The woman's going to stay home with the kids, be the
Yeah.
homemaker.
Yeah, that can
And
definitely be
that's-
an expression of it.
That can be an expression of, and there are some camps that would like, they would endorse that. They would almost say like, this is what it
This
should
is the
be.
godly biblical
This is the
way.
godly way of doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Whereas in an egalitarian expression in the home, you're going to tend to see, both working, or even maybe the opposite. Like the woman is
Yeah.
and so, and then in the church specifically, you're going to see in this side of things, there's going to be more women preachers and
women
on
pastors.
board. Yeah. Pastors, actually
Elders
called
even.
pastors, elders on board of directors. Whereas over here, you're not going to see that.
Yeah, like if you go on a church website and the women on staff are all called directors, no one's a pastor,
Right.
you know right away that's a complementarian church. And again, that is an interpretation of scripture that a lot of my brothers and sisters are in, and I love them and respect
Yes.
them. I happen to be in a different, more egalitarian camp.
Right.
Why am I telling you this story? Oh, I spoke at this church that was
Spoke
more
at this church.
complementarian.
We had to
But
give a
they
little
ended up-
context.
I ended up like holding court with like 6 guys because they did not know what to do with me, and they're asking me all these questions about gender roles and like women in the church, and it was actually really fun. Like they were like, how does this work in your marriage, and how does this work in the church? And I was like, you guys, my husband loves Jesus and he empowers me. They were like, we really have to think about this.
And it was like genuine curiosity,
It was beautiful, genuine
Oh, wow.
curiosity. They weren't being jerks. They weren't trying to put me in my place. They were just really like, but it was almost funny to me because
Wow.
I was like, wow, this is a sincere question for you. Can I
That's
empower
awesome.
my wife, my future wife? And I was like, yes, you can. Anyway, Davey,
Wow.
I don't know why I went off on that tangent, but the church needs women. Women needs the church.
Yeah. Well, I heard on the Bema podcast, and I actually just preached about this at the time of this recording yesterday at a church. We were talking about marriage, and we're talking about helper.
Yeah.
And the Bema podcast, which I've talked about before, kind of brings an Eastern context to,
Yep.
Understanding Scripture. That the Hebrew word helper actually has a connotation of two opposing forces leaning against each other. And that's the understanding of that from a Hebrew perspective is, there is a complementing, there's an aspect of there's an aspect of him and an aspect of her that has to have each other.
Yes.
And they're not like, one is not subservient to the other.
Right.
And then when you like prop this up with 1 Peter 3 and with Ephesians 5 and the verses of submission, you see, yes, it says wives submit to your husband, but before that, it precedes it by you should both be mutually submissive to the Holy
to
Spirit
one
and
another!
mutually submissive to each other.
To each other.
And then you look at Ephesians 5 and actually the call to sacrificially laying down is actually stronger for the man.
Yep. Yep.
Right? Love your wife as Christ loved the church.
Right.
Giving himself up for her,
Right. Right.
and presenting her holy and blameless before the Lord. So there's like this, we can latch on to one side of things, or certain camps can latch. And so anyways, it's really interesting when you start to think about and you broaden your perspective on some of this and going, okay, what does this look like?
Yeah.
And it's really strange. Man, I'm getting really transparent. Why should I do this right now? Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
So, I've been married twice now.
Yeah. Oh, wow,
And
baby.
My previous marriage with Amanda functioned a lot more like a complementarian expression of marriage.
Yeah.
And that was solely because of that was just our gift sets and how they melded.
Yeah.
Right. And it just, that was what Amanda desired. That's what, my marriage now, it actually functions more as an expression of an egalitarian marriage.
Isn't that wild?
So
This
it's
is why I
real.
don't think you can have a prescription, because every marriage has its own DNA. And really, before Jesus and in your church community, I think the couples have to really figure out, what's God calling us to do?
It really is.
Do you have to say, we're this or we're this? Or is God doing something fresh and new? Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's interesting.
No.
You've had both experiences.
I know. And
Do
it,
you
it goes back to our
do you
last
like one
conversation.
better than the other? Just kidding. Just
Well,
kidding.
some of them are more, I'll be truthful. Okay. This is very myopic. I'm not doing a whole discourse on this. So please don't we could talk about this for hours, but as a male, one was a lot easier,
Yeah, right.
but it's
right.
simply because I had frankly more control of the situation.
Power?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm learning the beauty of, and that wasn't like a control or power, like a abuse. No, at all. But it was just something like in regards to finances, Amanda didn't want to make decisions around the finance. We would, if I would come to her hey, here's something big that we need to talk about together. And she'd be like, I trust you, just kind of handle it. And that was so easy. But now we're talking there's a beauty and a complication with, this sounds so weird saying this, because as I say it out loud, I'm like, well, this is how marriage should be, where we're making these decisions together. And we're even quote unquote earning power is we're like, Christy could earn way more money than I could. And it's just, I'm saying all this to say there's so much beauty in taking the distinct, unique, the gifts and the callings that God has put on each of us, and figuring out how those work together. There's a reason God has us together.
That's right.
So how do they work together? And now how do I lay down my pride? Call it what it is, pride. And how do I no, you know what? I need to die to myself.
Yeah. And how do you empower Christy to run?
And learn. And then how do I empower her to, because I do have, we do have a role in that too.
Yep.
And like saying, hey, we have to, because our culture has been so complementarian for so long, we actually have to take some kind of an initiative to be open up the doors for those conversations. So anyways,
I didn't mean to make you go off.
We're not going to edit any of this, but it's going to be.
It's out there. Are you sure, Davey? Are you okay that it's out
That's
there?
fine. It's fine with me. You guys got to know that we're all journeying this to at this right now. We're like living this out in real time.
Yeah.
And so if you guys will let us be vulnerable and transparent with you, then we'll keep being vulnerable.
That's
but
right. That's right.
So here's a 3 testing vulnerability right now. You don't want to mess that up.
I'm proud of you, Davey. Good job.
Don't mess that up.
Yeah. Let him be vulnerable, please. Let it continue. All right. Well, we have so many incredible conversations, resources, classes, videos, coaches, episodes like this, where we want to talk with you and help resource you in all kinds of pain points. It can be church pain, but also a lot of what we do here is child loss, marriage betrayal, loss of friends, family members, trauma, tragedy, major life transitions. And so whatever it is you're walking through, we want to invite you to go to our website, nothingiswasted.com. Check out our community platform, our Community Plus platform, where we have so many incredible resources and other things for you.
Yeah. Aubrey, I was just reminded of this. I got a text message from a friend of mine who said, hey, I have a friend who's really struggling through something with her marriage. And she just doesn't know where to turn, and she's going to seek therapy and stuff. And my friend was like, you really need God to be in this. Like, you don't just need to go and seek therapy from some random counselor who's not going to come from a biblical perspective and Holy Spirit filled environment, right? And so she goes, let me text my friend David in their ministry and what they have, see if they have anything that could help you. And I'm like, yeah, we have a coach for that very pain point that she is walking through right now. And we actually had 2. I'm like, let's get her on a call with Ken Roberts, our coaching director. And the next day, this woman was on a call. She's getting connected with a coach. And I was thinking about that, Aubrey. I'm like, I'm so grateful for what God is building with Nothing is Wasted Ministries and what he has built, because we have a place for people to, and that's what, guys, sorry, I'm super excited about this. Here's Vision coming out now. This is how I mask some of the vulnerability that I
you
just entered into, right? All of a sudden I'm like, okay, now I'm going to get into Vision performance mode. No, seriously, like the anvil that you see on our logo, that is very strategic. That is very intentional, because what we want to be as a ministry is we want to be the placeholder for God's shaping in your life.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you have a blacksmith that is shaping a tool or a weapon, right, there is a lot of pain associated with that. And we're just the placeholder for that. We're just the anvil and so we want to be that resting place for you, and that's what God's building right now. And so that, anyways,
so
I'm just really, it gets me excited about it.
Yeah, God is doing incredible things here. So again, we want to invite you to go to nothingiswasted.com/community. We also want to thank Sleeping at Last for providing all of the music for the Nothing is Wasted podcast. You can stream his music wherever it is you do so. We also love engaging with you on social media. We're on Instagram at Nothing is Wasted Ministries, at Davey Blackburn, at ObSamp. And be sure to review, like, and subscribe here on YouTube and on the podcast as well. By doing so, you'll help many other people hear these incredible pain to purpose stories and access our resources and all kinds of fun things. Hey, next week we're joined by Kristen Wetherell, who I feel like I know her, but I know she writes about Christ's work sustaining the work of motherhood, and when you have fears, trusting God's promises, finding hope when it hurts. And so she's just like, nothing is wasted to a T.
Yeah.
And you're going to love our conversation with her. So why don't we go ahead and take a little listen to part of that conversation with Kristen Wetherell.
The first thing I'll say is I think it's really helpful when you feel like giving up to have people holding your arms up. You know, I think about Moses and his family holding his arms up. And there have been times when I have been physically incapable of doing certain things, when I have been spiritually in a dark place. You know, I think Martin Lloyd-Jones, the pastor from the 40s, calls it spiritual depression, you know, where you kind of feel like the clouds are just covering the sun.
Yeah.
and they just won't lift. And the joy of your salvation is gone, or so it seems. And I just think we need God's people to hold our arms up.
Yeah.
And by nature, dependence equals weakness, and I don't want to be weak.
Don't like that. Yeah.
I would like to be like God. I would like to have no limits and provide everything that I need for myself. That's just our flesh. That's natural. But the Lord is humbling us and teaching us the joy of depending on Him.
Yeah.
And often that comes through His body, His hands and feet.